Hi, I'm Hailee. I'm 25 and 10 years ago I almost died, and this is my story.
Look.
Haley's in her sister's room and she's gonna get in trouble.
I was born in March of 2001 to two loving parents and an older sister, and then a couple of years later my brothers were added into the mix. When my mom was pregnant with me, the doctor discovered I had a pretty significant ventricular septal defect. And with that diagnosis, he was concerned that there were other issues going on throughout my body, so he recommended that my mom do an amniocentesis, and she did. And thankfully, that amniocentesis was clear. And by the time I was born, the ventricular septal defect did resolve on its own, thankfully, and I did not have a heart murmur at birth. However, there was an incidental finding after I was born of a mild case of mitral valve regurgitation in my heart, and it would just be something that I would have to have monitored yearly. After I was born, before being discharged from the hospital, my mom advocated for an apnea monitor to be sent home with me because my older sister had also had heart issues when she was a baby. They were actually a lot more significant than mine, and just based on prior history, my mom wanted to just be safe, and it was a good thing she advocated for that because a couple of weeks later I ended up having a really bad sleep apnea episode where I stopped breathing like 40 some odd times in the night, and that was my first hospitalization at a couple of weeks old. I was in the hospital for, I want to say, a week when I was little, with the doctors figuring out what to do to help me and my sleep apnea, and I ended up being put on a medication called theophylline, and thankfully over time I outgrew sleep apnea. In early infanthood, besides those two things, my parents thought I was a healthy and happy little baby, but as I began to get older, there were definitely concerns that they had. When I was a baby, what was the tip-off for you that something wasn't right?
I think it goes back to when I was pregnant with you and the doctor decided to do an echocardiogram on me because your sister was born with a heart condition, and out of an abundance of caution, we wanted to make sure there wasn't anything going on with your heart, so the doctor ordered an echocardiogram, and that's when we found out that you had a very large ventricular septal defect of your heart. And I was very devastated by that, thinking I have another kid with a heart condition. What is going on here? And that was my first indication when I was pregnant with you. Okay, so what did you want me to answer on these? What these were?
Yeah, so what other symptoms did I have?
And we had to go back in a notebook that I kept a journal of. But in the journal, it said that you had arm tremors, mostly on the right, throwing yourself back and arching your back, blank stares, crying, you were jumping. Like when she would go to sleep, she would constantly jump in her sleep all night long. And she wasn't sleeping, and we thought that it might have been a side effect of the theophylline, and maybe it could have been. But when she was about a year and a half old, she was diagnosed with mild CP, cerebral palsy, because that's what they thought she had, because she would only army crawl on one side. She was kind of a late walker. She didn't walk till she was 16 months old. She had to have baby orthotics that she would wear in her shoes because her feet pronated in, which means they go in like this as a C. And if you look at the back of Haley's heels, they go out like this. So once she got those, she was able to stand. And so she started getting diagnosed with different conditions. And I kept thinking, all of this has got to be related and somehow. And I would ask the doctor, and he would say, no, kids can have multiple things, and they'll grow out of it, and it's so mild. There is really nothing to worry about.
Between 6 months to a year old, I started having these vomiting episodes. And as they continued, they became more and more consistent as I got older and became a toddler and a child. And they would always be triggered around the same time, around stress, excitement, sickness, and they would just pop up on a very consistent cyclical basis. And it wasn't just me throwing up one time. These were full-on episodes, that's what we called them, of where I was essentially in an awake coma, where I wouldn't eat, I wouldn't drink, I wouldn't talk or respond to people. I was very, very weak, very, very shaky, very nauseous, and there were times where, yes, I did vomit a lot. There were other times where I only vomited once and I was still in this episode, and I would also just need to be in a dark, cool room in a fetal position. The room needed to be quiet. I just needed to be left alone. And over the first 5 years of my life, my parents took me to and from doctors and hospitals trying to find answers, and it was a long journey of trying to figure out what was wrong with me. When I was 4, I had kidney reflux surgery, which I did need, and we thought that, hey, maybe that's the cause of these vomiting episodes, but it obviously wasn't. And finally, when I was around 5, I had an appointment with a neurologist who diagnosed me with something called Cyclic Vomiting Syndrome, and that was the first time my parents had ever heard anything about it. So talk to me about like the landscape when I was diagnosed with CVS, like how much knowledge was out there about it?
Oh, there wasn't any knowledge. I didn't even know what it was. There wasn't any real websites to go on. And the doctor just kind of explained it like an abdominal migraine, or it could have been abdominal epilepsy. They did do an EEG on you, but that was inconclusive. And basically you had CVS, and with this medication that was going to make you all better. And in my mind, you were going to outgrow it, because he told me a lot of kids outgrow CVS. You will be fine. It's a childhood disease, not to worry. Everything else looked fine. Even though you were physically not a lot behind, but a little behind. Like just behind the curve. Like you walked later, you sat up later, you didn't run as fast, you would get tired easier. We just thought, you're just one of those kids who don't like physical activity. There are kids who are like that. Cognitively, you seem to keep up with all of your peers. And for a while, that seemed to work.
At the time I was diagnosed, it was the early 2000s. The internet was nothing like it is today. There was next to nothing anywhere about CVS. And when my parents would bring it up when I would be in the hospital having these episodes, they would be told, hey, that's not a real condition. You're making that up. And my parents eventually discovered a CVS support group that was 30 minutes away from where we lived. And they started going there to make connections, to figure out things that could help me, because while we discovered that going into the hospital and getting IV fluids would help pull me out of the episodes, they didn't prevent the episodes or cure them, so to say. In one meeting in particular in this support group, a doctor came and spoke about not only cyclic vomiting syndrome, which he did have a lot of experience with, but he was discussing how he found that in some of his patients there was overlap between cyclic vomiting syndrome and mitochondrial disease. And as he talked about mitochondrial disease, which is a genetic condition where your body doesn't make enough energy, and it's a condition that causes a lot of different health issues, as he continued to talk about that and go into more specifics, as well as like its connection with CVS and those specific patients, my parents were like, that's Hailee. That's her. All of the physical symptoms, the things that couldn't be explained, the misdiagnosis of cerebral palsy, the vomiting episodes, the getting really sick when I'm sick, not keeping up to my peers, all of that made a lot of sense when he was talking about it, and so my parents were able to get me in to see him. And in my first appointment with him, he confirmed the cyclic vomiting syndrome diagnosis, put me on medication for that, and he diagnosed me with mitochondrial disease. And for the next 6 years, I did not have a single episode. I stayed out of the hospital. The only time I would go in the doctor was for checkups, and I really got to experience a true childhood.
You guys are silly.
Hey guys, right now it's 9:55 and this is my last day to be 10 years old, so yeah. Hey guys, believe it or not, this is my doll's room. This is what happens when a tornado occurs. I can't find one.
You can't find what?
Ready? Now, wait. Put the top on, hurry!
You caught one!
Fun!
Yay!
In the summer of 2012, I was 11, and there was one morning that summer that I woke up with this very familiar feeling in my throat and in my body, and I couldn't place it, and I tried to eat and I couldn't eat, and the lights were too bright, and I just remember running into my parents' room, going into a fetal position under their covers, and just like not being able to really respond or do anything else. And that was when we all came to the realization that this was an episode, and that was just the start of a full year of really intense episodes. These were episodes that were more intense than they had been when I was younger. I lost a significant amount of weight in this time period. I got very weak. I ended up having to use a wheelchair to go places, and that was really, really hard for me as an 11-year-old. I had just gotten home from vacation. I had just gotten over being sick, and I was going here and there and everywhere as a classic 11-year-old, and I was also amidst the onset of puberty, and all of those things together worked against me and triggered the episodes again, and before I knew it, I was in and out of the hospital all over again.
This is the hospital room. There's the little TV. There's my IV.
It wasn't until the following year, 2013, that my doctor was able to find and prescribe me another medication that thankfully stopped the episodes. And for the next couple of years, things calmed down. I still had speed bumps. I had other chronic illness issues pop up here and there unrelated to CVS. It wasn't a worry-free couple of years, but ultimately I was able to build back up my endurance. And I got to a point where I no longer needed a wheelchair, hardly ever. Really only really long days, like at a theme park or at a museum. Things that required a lot of walking. And I really had some of the best memories and the best times. But all of that changed in January of 2016. I woke up one morning in the beginning of January sick with an upper respiratory virus. I knew I was sick. I knew I didn't feel good. But I knew that if I told my mom that morning that I didn't feel good, she would not allow me to go on the field trip I had been really wanting to go on with my class. And so I didn't say anything. And I went on this field trip to this museum with my friends. I refused to bring my wheelchair, even though I knew there was going to be a lot of walking. And that day at the museum, I got really close to almost passing out. That had never happened before to me. That was something completely new. And by the time I got home, I just felt awful, and I was in bed sick as a dog that whole week. But by the end of that week, like the beginning of the following week, I felt all back to myself. I felt all better. And so I resumed my life, and I went to my homeschool group that following Wednesday. And I came home and I knew something was wrong, because when I came home, I was really shaky and I was really weak. And in the past, when I had a day like that, I would sometimes go to the ER, get one bag of IV fluids, and that would be all I needed, and then I would be able to go home. And so my parents decided that that's what we were going to do, going to go to the ER at the local children's hospital, get IV fluids, and then be sent home. Maybe I just needed some extra help after I got sick, but I ended up going there and I got admitted at the hospital, and I was there for a total of 10 days and came home on a PICC line because every time they tried to wean me down on fluids, my body would start crashing. My body and minds would kind of just shut down, and I would go into a fetal position. Everything was too loud and too bright, and I really couldn't. It's hard to explain, but it was like my body was fully shutting down every time they tried to wean me off of these IV fluids. And going home on a PICC line was never something I anticipated. I had heard before of central lines in passing, but I didn't really know what they were. And I remember being so scared to get the PICC line placed in my arm. It was such like an anxious time for me, and I remember my dad just was trying to make me laugh and help me through the whole experience. And I went home on a PICC line hoping that maybe I just needed a couple more days of fluids or another week or another month, worst case scenario. But as I got home and each day passed, I wasn't getting better and no one could explain why. My doctors kind of tried everything they could think of. My doctor had increased my medications to see if that would help or if that was the issue. I ended up starting to see a new pediatrician, and she had the idea of having me drink all of this water and Pedialyte and Neocate Splash to see if replicating the amount of fluids I was getting would help me wean off of IV fluids. And as each day kind of went on in January into February, I also was evaluated to see if there was anything else going on, and I ended up being diagnosed with POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and I remember that diagnosis being a beacon of hope, because I'm like, well, okay, now that you've explained what that is, that would make sense why I almost passed out at the museum in January. Maybe that would explain why the IV fluids are helping me so much, because there's issues with blood volume and whatnot. I really didn't know any better, but that was just short-lived hope, because even though I was diagnosed and medicated for it, and the medication definitely helps those symptoms, it wasn't the answer, because I was still shaky and I was still weak on these fluids, and every time they would wean me down at home, I would get more weak and I would get more shaky and I would start crashing again. And I remember just being so confident that, okay, everything's going to turn out right. Everything's going to be okay. But as each day dwindled on, I realized slowly but surely, maybe it won't be okay. I thought I was promised that like everything would turn out all right. I thought that's what it means to believe in God, like that everything is going to be all right. But that couldn't have been further from the truth.